Hello, I'm Carol Smaldino, and welcome to the Human Climate. My guest today is Dr. Niki Harre. Nikki is a psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I am talking to you as you are in New Zealand, which is for me very exciting because I'm in Colorado, and that's one of the nice things about technology. So, welcome.
Thank you,
Um,
Carol.
I I want to start by saying that as I was reading your book, The Infinite Game, I I was having my doubts about our speaking because, on the surface, at least, I come from a different point of view or a different perspective. Let's say, I talk a lot about the shadow, the Carl Jung concept, the idea that we need to uh, integrate better, come to know our different feelings so we don't have to project them onto other people and we don't have to demonize. And at the same time, we don't have to feel empty in ways that make us put people on pedestals. But then I I had this idea that actually really fit in with your book, which is that perhaps we were coming from different points, but that we were complementing each other. And then I thought about the openness and the flourishing that you talk about in the I'm sorry, it is intimate, infinite game. So it seemed to make sense to me. And so I'm glad about that. So, to begin, I think I'd like you to describe or just say what you mean by the infinite game.
Thanks, Carol. Lovely to talk to you today. So originally the concept was put forward by a philosopher and theologian, James Cass, and so I really built on his ideas. So I want to acknowledge him in talking about this. So the infinite game, as I've interpreted it and developed it, is really about keeping the game in play. And that means keeping what we as human beings most deeply value in play. And it's also about inviting others into the game. So it's very open, it's very creative, it's very responsive. It assumes that the future is genuinely unknown and that we are co-creating it together. Now, what's important is that there's another kind of game, and that's finite games. And
Mhm.
so these games are the rules, roles, structures, bureaucracies by which we organise ourselves. Now, we've got to have these. We've got road rules, we've got COVID vaccinations, we've got schools, we've got various kinds of laws, we've got education systems, you name it. But the thing about infinite games is that sometimes they can start to get really disconnected from those core deep values, and they can start to really spin on their own axis and get out of control. So we might have a social system, a way of doing things that's very hierarchical, that's oppressive for one group or another, or that rides roughshod over the natural world. And that game's got a momentum that keeps it going, even though it's starting to damage what we truly value.
Okay, that's the beginning. I wanted to ask you a little more about finite games.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as you as you talk about the anxiety of about the future or about the present, how it's easy out of that anxiety to go back to the past, to go back to the games, let's say, as you describe, that were used in the past and that people assume they're going to work in the present, but they don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Often what happens, these games get their own momentum. So one really good example is the oil extraction game, which we know is not working. So the burning of fossil fuels we know is causing climate change. And so why do we keep doing it? Like at one level, it seems kind of crazy that we keep on with this. But of course, when you start to look at how human life works, you understand that this game is everywhere. It's actually being played in all these different centres. Even if you physically imagine driving around your city, there's petrol stations, gas stations all over the place. They're these actual physical entities, and you drive your car and you fill it up. And that's just one element, of course. Then there's, the heating and the industry that uses various forms of fossil fuels and so on. So one of the, and if you really, really start to drill down, what happens is human beings wake up in the morning and they get into their petrol-driven car, or if they're working at a higher level, they go to their drilling, the oil rig, or they find new places to explore for oil, because that's what they do, because that's what they did yesterday and that's what they're going to do today. And that's the default position for all of us, to just continue with this habitual way of living. And the more complexly integrated it is, the harder it is to pull it out. So you and I could decide tomorrow we're going to start ballet lessons, and that's fine because nobody really cares and we can just do it if you like. But we couldn't decide just to sort of walk out on our families very easily, because other people might start to protest, because that's all integrated. So these more difficult games are very, very hard to just extract and break away, because they're part of human habits, and because we're all playing. And it's almost like we need this moment where we all agree to drop the game. And it's very, very hard to create that as a society. Another problem with the games is that the people who are good at a game become the winners in society, and then they choose what game we play next. So if you think about, say, how education or university, for example, works, and I'm in a university, well, who runs universities? People who are good at university education, people who did well in their degrees, who know what it's all about. So when they're designing a program, they design it on the basis of what they learned. And what works for them. Again, it's not malicious or evil, it's just what they know. And so the people coming up through the system, again, learn from the past in a sense, because the people at the top are controlling the education that they receive. And so it's much harder than it sounds at first to bring in these sort of novel responses to a changing environment, because habit is so tightly and complexly held between us as human beings.
It actually doesn't seem easy at all. In fact, when you talk about the heads of the game, or the winners of the finite game, and you talk about oil as one example, what comes to my mind is, no matter how you slice it, there are people in immense power. And so what comes to my mind is, how could, whether it's the shadow or whether it's the infinite game, how could they ever become interesting enough to the people at the top? And if they don't, these people who control so much, what then?
And don't forget that those people who look to you and I like they're in control are not really in control. You see this with US presidents, of course. That's a really good example of somebody who looks incredibly powerful, but in fact is restrained in so many ways by the system in which they're embedded. So, the CEO of an oil company, they can't just suddenly decide we're going to go for wind farms. It's far more complex than that. They have to get their shareholders on board. They have to have the technology. There's a whole big system. So I think I'm a bit wary of focusing too much on the individuals with power, rather than thinking about the game as a whole and what's keeping that in play.
Okay. I want to jump to God.
Yeah, let's.
Kind of poetic and literal. But you do talk about God. and you do
mm,
talk about the shift from a spiritual entity or a spiritual set of possibilities for people to find some degree of peace or truth or enlightenment, and that shifting into a system where people are punished if they don't buy into the need to believe at any cost. And yeah, so I hear you that you want to focus on the system, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
about the God aspect or about the
The God and
yeah,
the
yeah. I mean, it of course, when I talk about focusing on the system, I definitely don't mean that people are without agency and can't shape and change systems. So I just want to really clarify that element of it. And the God piece has become particularly interesting for me this year because I'm actually attending a Christian church, doing an ethnography of the church for my own, to really explore what it is like to live a life which is infused with the idea of God and, of course, within Christianity, Jesus as well. I've always been an atheist and was brought up that way, so don't have a feeling for what that's like. And one of the things I'm finding really fascinating about my exploration into Christianity, which includes reading various books by Christian writers, is the way in which they actually evoke this entity that always stands apart from the human games or the human systems. So it sort of recognizes that there's always going to be something broken about our games, about the way that we relate to each other, because we are not God. You cannot have a perfect fit with the way life works as soon as you construct any kind of human system. And I think what a notion of God or a spiritual part of your life, those kinds of ideas do, is they give you a space to stand back from it all and to have a bit of perspective. And that perspective might allow you to break that habitual playing of whatever infinite game you're in, whatever finite game you're trapped in. So I think I'm really fascinated by that. I'm pretty interested in the way identity politics is playing out all over the Western world, certainly. Certainly in the US, certainly in New Zealand. There's a lot of that going on, and people get really involved as if the name of the game is to sort out which groups are oppressing which group and who's on top and how we sort all of that out. Whereas if you take a step back, that even if you solve that problem, you've still got, really deep problems like poverty and environmental destruction and so on going on. So I'm really interested in that perspective taking, that standing back and looking at things as if you're not part of them, which I think God enables you to do a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I'm thinking about the differences between New Zealand and the US, and there have to be immense and many differences. And I don't really know if you in New Zealand have a significant evangelical movement, which is a little bit of a problem for those of us who want to help improve the planet, because a lot of people in that department are rooting for the apocalypse. So,
Mm.
yeah, do you have that?
Not to a very large extent. I mean, obviously there are sort of some pockets, but I mean, when I say attending a Christian church, I chose one that was, you'd call it liberal. there's nothing like that in it. The church is very open to all different perspectives, believes in science, works alongside other faiths, and so it doesn't have that edge to it. I mean, Christianity, of course, can become a finite game in itself, as we know full well. Religions are full of rules and dogmas and hierarchies and all the rest of it. So I'm talking more about a sort of, if you like, good church as a vehicle for standing back a little bit, or religious practices allowing people to do that. Mm.
Well, apropos of that, I was thinking of the fact that I'm Jewish and I feel very Jewish, but I'm not religious per se. I was remembering you're talking about World War II as an allegedly righteous war, which I had I had like a startled reaction to that, because it's like, how could you be questioning that? Because the Holocaust, and obviously, and I know something about the mixed motives of the West, of the nations who joined against Hitler, as as not being so pure and as being delayed, and as the U.S. for one having a great deal of anti-Semitism. But could you say something about what your take is on World War II, like not necessarily being a righteous war?
Yeah, I mean, it's more that, I use that as an example, but I don't in any way claim to be an expert on that particular situation. But what I do know is somebody, I was born in 1961, so I've reflected recently, it's actually only 16 years after the end of the war. And I was taught as a school child that this war needed to happen. Hitler was bad, taught about the Holocaust, and as if there was really no choice, and it was all part of a story that sometimes that kind of aggression is necessary, that's inevitable, that it's part of how you have to operate. And then as I got older, I thought, I talk in the book about this idea of pawns. So one of the things that finite games do is they create pawns, and that is people that are not really invited to play the game in a creative way, but are like human fodder, really, for the game itself. So if you think about marketing, the game of marketing a product, actually the consumers of that product are often pawns, basically. Marketers are not necessarily very interested in them as human beings, as thriving human beings, but as buyers of that particular message. So the game's set up so that they're, in a sense, quite passive within it. So what I began to think is, well, in a way, the story of World War II is given to me as if my job is simply to accept it, to say, yes, that was a just war. Yes, the Allies did the right thing. Yes, Hitler was the epitome of evil, etc., etc. And then if you look even a tiny bit into the story of that war, there were horrific things done by the other side. The bombing of German cities, the number of German civilians that died, what happened in Berlin after World War II, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US, like all sorts of horrific things. And so it's just more that I want a more complex story, and I don't want to be told what I'm supposed to think. And I don't want one appallingly evil act, the Holocaust, dreadful, shameful thing, to somehow mean that all the other horrors were justified. So that's really what it comes down to. And When I look at so many stories of history, I mean, we know this, that those stories are told from a perspective, often to achieve a particular end. And that end might be the labelling of one group as good and the labelling of one group as bad. It might be to justify revenge of various types, to justify settlements and so on. Yeah, so really that's my take on that World War II situation.
Well, it kind of fits in with your take on the infinite game, because you're talking about creating space, even mental space, to think and to ask and to wonder. And I think you probably have followed the critical race theory debate in the States. Are you familiar? Are you familiar?
Yeah, I have some familiarity with that. Yes.
Well, I mean, that also has to do with our accepting as a country and as individuals that we have been part of the legacy, at the very least, of systemic racism, and that needs to be taught. But, there are a lot of people who say, I'm not going to let my kid be called a racist, so I don't want that taught. At the same time, I see you as being very much against just labeling people as good or bad, which I think is refreshing. You talk about the uncomfortable hypocrisy.
So the idea of uncomfortable hypocrisy is that we have to play the games that are of our culture. We have to eat, we have to drink, we have to, all of those kinds of things. But very often we're quite uncomfortable with those games and we see a problem with them. So I think we have to be allowed to speak against the games that we continue to play. And that's the sort of midway position between now and the future. So I have to be able to say driving a petrol-based car is an unsustainable thing that can't go on while I continue to drive a petrol-based car, for example. And I think if we prevent people from speaking out against problematic habits that they are doing, then it's really hard to get change, because we're all caught in these games, as well as being able to look on and see the nature of the problem. So, I mean, to go back to the critical race theory and to people not wanting their child to be called a racist, I think the really tricky thing, and you'll have ideas on this from the Jungian perspective for sure, is the shame notion. Whether we're, do you think it's acceptable to deliberately evoke shame in people? Is that a good way to move forward? Is that just a byproduct of a higher good, which is racial equality or something like that? What do you think?
Well, I don't find it very effective. I mean, I have a particular allergy to shame. So if I'm in a conversation and I just remember somebody referring to a man as Nigerian, and a relative of hers just yelled, "That's so racist." And I thought, whoa. First of all, I don't get why it's racist, because if a man comes from Nigeria, he comes from Nigeria. But I think, if anything, shame can push people into the sidelines and people to hide even more. I think, this is maybe an extreme thing to say, and I'm not sure I'd be good at living it, but I think that we all need empathy. And then I'll go to Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book just mercy. And, he's a lawyer are you familiar with him? He's
No.
defended many people on death row, and he's defended many people who can't afford a lawyer. And he and his group, Equal Justice Initiative, have started, I think, the first memorial to lynchings in the United
Mm,
States. And he writes that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done, including murder.
mm,
I
mm,
think, and actually, recently I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Mary Gordon, who has a book called Roots of Empathy and an organization of the same name. And she writes actually about Nazis and people in South Africa, and I'm sure people all over who hate other people. Uh, she writes about their having no empathy really, and
mm,
so and when I first read that, I thought, wow, I don't think I've ever heard or read anybody speak about such big topics as including a lack of empathy. But I think she's right, and I think um, if you just push people into shame, I think you push emotions back into the darkness,
mm,
back into the shadow. And one of the things about the shadow is we can act as if we're admitting some of the terrible things we've done or that have come before us, and we can become politically correct, which is, I guess, its own game.
mm,
And
mm,
I think it's its own finite game because you have he, she, they who become the most good, the most efficient at becoming politically correct, and they win elections or they get on a particular pedestal at a given time.
mm.
So, and of course, there's the opposite. And there's, he who shall not be mentioned, but he's on the minds of all Americans that I know. And, that Trump is the opposite, that well, I guess he's politically correct to his own group, in
Mm.
that he he stands above that, above passing for a caring person, and certainly above any passing for anyone that's vulnerable.
Mm.
So I guess I would have to say that shame is kind of the enemy. I think that people need to know that whatever we've done does not encompass all of who we are, and I think that needs to encourage people to come out of the woodwork and share some of the things that they feel guilty for or ashamed of or in doubt about. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I totally agree with you. Yeah, really enjoyed listening to what you were saying there because I do feel we're playing a shame game around uh, both political correctness and, as you point out, the other side of that, which is the demonizing of groups that are clearly materially disadvantaged and discriminated against. So it's like both sides are dealing in shame, really.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think for me personally, when I am ashamed, or the things in my life that cause me shame when I think about them, there's a stuckness there. There's I cannot be creative, I cannot be open, I cannot be generous, I cannot listen to what is coming in when I'm in that space. And
Yeah.
yeah, you actually need to have, and the other thing about it, as we both know, is you actually, to a degree, you can do work on yourself to remove that, but really you need someone or something to affirm your worthiness. You need um, you need that to be part of the social conversation, that you are a worthy person, and you need to enter into environments that welcome you in, that take the gifts that you've got, rather than immediately labeling and categorizing you. One of the things, for the Infinite Game, I've run dozens of workshops where we explore this, and one of the things that I do in those is that when people arrive to play an infinite game, which is attend one of these workshops, I often get them to write on a piece of paper all the things that they would normally use to identify themselves. So they might say, this is my name, I'm from this place, I have this job, I blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is that they would normally use to label themselves, they write that on a bit of paper and then they put it in a jar at the door. And so the idea is, just for this hour, we're going to leave our identities at the door and we're going to come into the space with only our first names, and that's how we're going to play. And I think that kind of attempt, again, it's really what I was talking about it before, that attempt to stand back a bit from the details of how we relate to each other according to these fixed categories. It is refreshing, it is enabling, and it brings up new possibilities.
Well, I think I agree with you. And I also think that part of the shame can be that, oh my God, how was I so stupid to have believed everything that I was taught in school? I certainly have had that feeling, as
Mm,
well as a kind of grief, a sadness about, all those idols I thought were, I mean, I was seriously saddened. I don't know if depressed is the right word, but really upset when I read in high school that some of the best presidents of the United States had slaves. Like, how is
mm,
that? Um, and in terms of what you said before about when you feel badly, you can feel stuck. I've been thinking lately about the difference between grief and regret. And I think regret can be important, but if it stays in place, it's it drives out the spirit really. And as grieving something, I think of as passing through some emotions and getting to the other side, or getting to, more life.
mm, mm.
I mean, speaking of more life, your book is extremely alive and lively. And I think it makes the reader want to play. So I think it has a playful aspect to it, which I enjoyed. But I do want to talk to you about climate and climate change.
Yeah, let's do that. And thank you for the nice comments.
Okay, you're welcome. The other day, I'm trying not to watch as much news, uh, get out of the orbit of that.
Mm,
And we 24-hour news cycle that never ends. I tend to read it online and I read the headlines and see what I want to pursue, because otherwise it's just all too much. But I happened on seeing Barack Obama speak at the climate conference,
mm,
and I have to say I was kind of enchanted, which is, I think, one of the problems with Barack Obama, that he can be very enchanting. It's not his problem, but it's a problem for some of us who could use to be a little more critical thinkers about some of
mm,
what he's done. But he was advocating and beseeching young people of the world to take on the job, really, at the banner of combating climate change. And he basically did say, it's your job, it's your planet, you can do it. I'll talk to you later this afternoon. And then I was reading your book, and how I was interested. I was kind of compelled by your own message that young people should not be given the job. to save the planet, that they are activists in training, and that they need the message that the rest of us kind of have this, or we're at least working it. So they can have a modicum and more than a modicum of hope. You know, talk about hope that's complacent, that is kind of lazy, I guess, that takes things for granted and is passive. But as opposed to a different kind of hope that's motivated hope, where people are actually trying to make things better, but they're not doing it alone. And they're certainly not being told, we made this mess for you. Now you clean it up because you're going to have to take it over. So we're depending on you. So perhaps you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel very strongly that telling young people that it's their job is, if you think it through, to me, that's very rarely an appropriate thing to say. There might be times and contexts in which you can say that, but generally speaking, like you say, I do see young people as activists in training. I think our job as adults is to hold them. And one of the things I increasingly think is that it's critical we work on ourselves in the sense that we are able to be centered and that we are not transmitting to them the fear that we might hold. So the thing that I find really problematic is when adults who are full of fear about the future talk to young people in such a way that they're getting this message that the future is full of fear. And then for young people, of course, that is their life. We're not talking about people here who've already had children, who've had a career or not have a career, who've, done these things, whether or not they've been successful. We are talking about people looking ahead with all of that before them. And I actually find it really heartbreaking that sometimes, often with the best intent, adults give them the message that all of that, the possibility of children, a career, of just loving other people is doomed because your job is to be a warrior for the climate. I don't like that. And also the other thing is that it is actually true that lots of people are working towards mitigating this problem. Lots of adults, lots of actually really old people, as well as, people all throughout the age spectrum, people all over the world. Climate change simply cannot be solved. It makes no sense to even begin to talk about it as a sort of individual hero issue. It is going to be creative responses and local responses all over the world, accompanied by a sense of being part of a big network that's all driving in the same direction. So I want to welcome young people into that network and never make them feel that it's on them, that it's on their shoulders. I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's ethical, really.
So I agree, for sure. I want to get back to empathy for a minute, because I am concerned about the people who, as you mentioned, can get so pessimistic or worried that they start detaching, or the people who are so detached from empathy and empathy towards themselves as well. I don't feel that there's a tremendous amount of empathy in our culture. I think there's a tremendous amount of indulgence. But I don't think that's the same as empathy, because empathy is really deep and it's caring about all the different aspects inside of us and inside of other people. So, and there is a very puritanical side to a lot of the parenting in America, where people want from their children a certain kind of behavior, and they want that produced, but it's hard for them to give the empathy for the states in the middle. So I kind of worry about the people at the top of the finite games that do seem to have infinite power to
Mm.
stop positive change. And how do you see that? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about empathy. I actually think empathy and compassion are two really important sort of words, ideas, notions, things to develop in ourselves. I've been this year, along with my sort of exploration into Christianity, I've been talking and experimenting with compassionate listening, which is really that attempt to listen fully into somebody's position until you get to the point where you really see where they're coming from, and sort of really have in a sense got to that point of empathy, so that suddenly it makes human sense to you. And it's interesting because I think, political correctness stops that, because people are too scared to really work out what the other person's saying. They just want to respond in a way that will keep the categories going in the way they've been taught. So, I mean, I'm sure, well, I know you have the same issue that we have here around people who don't want to be vaccinated against COVID-19. And then, so that's one issue in which you can have people who are very pro the vaccination and people who are anti it, and really try and listen. Where is this person coming from? Like, how can I get to the point where I can see, and again, I mean see in that really deep way, why this matters to them, even though I'm on the opposite side. And I actually think you can train that in people. I think you can, because empathy is part of our nature, and it's there if we're trained to allow it to be, really, rather than fight it off out of this nice, polite respect thing, and an unwillingness to really get to know the other because it seems too dangerous, for various different reasons. As for the, those people with unbridled power, I do go back to what I said before, because it might be that there's people that have a lot of power, and maybe they're sociopaths that simply have no empathy. But for me personally, I've always been interested in working with just the people on the ground, the people that are around me, and just trying to build up those positive qualities and that resilient, loving community that can respond creatively, even if there's tyrants, so that that's kept alive. Because I just don't know how you make the big, massive political changes.
well, I don't know. Maybe someday the people at the top will think that they can have money and empathy. And maybe the people at the top will consent to be interviewed by us or someone else, and they'll get some empathy. And maybe if they get some empathy, I don't know, they may have a breakthrough. just
Yeah.
just thought that came to me. And
Yeah.
I think we can end here, because I think what happened just now for me, so I thank you again, was that I had an infinite game thought that I might not have had we not been in this conversation. And that, so there's the idea that just conversing with each other as a group or as just two people can open things up, can open our pores up to becoming more curious or having new thoughts.
Mm, mm. I mean, in a sense, there's only a few things human beings do together, isn't there? There's violence, there's fighting, there's all of that. There's working alongside each other in a physical sense, doing something, cooking a meal, harvesting a garden, all of those kinds of activities. And then there is talking. And talking to each other is actually, all cultures do it, and we do it kind of all the time, really. Like we're chatterboxes. And so how we do that is crucial to the environments that we're creating.
I put a chapter in my own small book called Talking Out Loud. And I really didn't mean anything about loudness per se. I meant just kind of talking without having an agenda and sharing, and lo and behold, possibly changing our minds in the middle of that. And of course, that's about listening as well. But it's a particular way of talking, which is, having the willingness, even if it's not pleasant at times, but having the willingness to learn.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think, and it is, what worries me is the way in our universities, at least, there's such nervousness about that at the moment. Yeah.
I think what you're saying is really important, and I hope that changes.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this, as it gets very dark here, and it gets quite light where you are. But it's nice to talk across the globe.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Carol. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, me too. Okay, you take care and keep up the infiniteness.
Thanks. Same to you.